June 1941. Europe trembles under the shadow of the Wehrmacht. The Third Reich has unleashed the largest land invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers march east with a clear objective: destroy the Soviet Union. Hitler seeks to deliver a lightning strike against Stalin. And during the first months, everything seems to go according to plan. Kiev and Minsk fell quickly. The Nazi war machine advanced relentlessly, pushing the Soviets deep into their own territory. And in the middle of that desperate retreat, the Soviet High Command decided to entrench itself in a strategic and symbolic place: the Crimean Peninsula, a natural fortress between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, a coveted land, key to controlling the south. But the Germans were not willing to let their prey escape. And so began a brutal campaign where every hill, every village, and every meter gained would be paid with blood. Through the eyes of the Führer and his soldiers, we enter the Battle of Crimea, September 24th, 1941. At dawn, the first units of the German army crossed the Perekop Isthmus, the gateway to Crimea. The offensive has begun. The Soviet troops, weakened and disorganized after the retreat caused by Operation Barbarossa, prepare for a desperate defense. The peninsula becomes the new battlefield. At the head of the invading forces is one of the brightest military minds of the Third Reich, General Erich von Manstein. Intelligent, calculating, and cold as steel. Manstein is not a mere executor. He is a strategist. He knows the terrain, studies his enemy, and encircles him with surgical precision.
The plan for the ground attack was that 30th Corps should lead the way with 3 infantry divisions. They were to break through the Russian defenses and secure a route for the 22nd Panzer Division and a supporting infantry division. Their specific task was to enable 22nd Panzer Division to cross an anti-tank ditch at the back of the Soviet defenses. To help in this task, an infantry battalion was loaded into assault boats to outflank the ditch by sea.
His plan to take Crimea was not a simple frontal assault. With mastery, he applied the principles of blitzkrieg, but adapted them to difficult, mountainous, well-defended terrain. He used mobile units to cut supply lines and destabilize the Soviet rear, while his infantry divisions pinned the enemy from the front. In just a few weeks, he achieved the unthinkable, surrounding more than 100,000 Soviet soldiers and destroying them in small, isolated groups. Faced with this devastating panorama, the Red Army began to entrench itself in strategic places where it could reorganize its forces and fight against the German advance. One of those places was the Kerch Peninsula. From there, ferocious attacks were prepared against Nazi troops, beginning on December 26, 1941. Although they managed to land some blows against the Third Reich during 4 months of offensives, that time allowed Erich von Manstein himself to prepare for when his turn came.
Manstein insisted that the attack should be prepared by the 1st of May, but that it would not be launched until the weather was suitable. Fine weather was essential to dry the ground for the tanks and allow the Luftwaffe to bring its full weight to bear. Operation Bustard Hunt finally began on the 8th of May and ran almost exactly to plan. Almost every Soviet division was engaged on the first day of the operation, leaving almost no reserves.
Only 11 days after the German forces launched their counteroffensive, Kerch had fallen. On May 19, 1942, the Nazis entered victorious. They had annihilated their enemy with unprecedented brutality and stunning speed. The Soviet losses were immense, once again proving what kind of strategist von Manstein was.
11th Army had captured 170,000 Soviet troops and over 1,100 guns and 250 tanks, at a total cost of just over 7,500 casualties. Operation Bustard Hunt was a miniature example of blitzkrieg tactics, planned and executed by one of the greatest masters of the art. However, Manstein still had unfinished business at Sevastopol. That would be a very different sort of battle.
By mid-1942, practically all of Crimea was under German control, except for one city, Sevastopol. That natural fortress had become the last Soviet stronghold, with its troops shielded by coastal artillery, trenches, bunkers, and kilometers of underground tunnels. Von Manstein knew that taking it would be one of the most difficult tasks on the Eastern Front. He was also aware that the new battlefield was very different from the previous ones. Here, blitzkrieg tactics had no place. The soldiers had to prepare for another kind of war. For the Germans, this was a thorn in the side. For Stalin, a symbol of resistance. And for the soldiers fighting, it was hell on earth. From the beginning of the Crimean campaign, the troops of the German 11th Army had tried to attack the city, but the Soviets resisted fiercely. The mined hills became a death sentence for German soldiers advancing under a rain of mortars, machine guns, and coastal artillery. Every meter required sacrifice. For months, the fighting was intermittent but brutal. Finally, realizing that the fall of Sevastopol would not be quick, the Nazis decided to besiege it. However, the Black Sea Fleet continued to supply weapons, food, and reinforcements through the port. The city stood firm. It was then that von Manstein understood he was facing one of his greatest tactical challenges, so he decided not to launch a hasty new assault. The Red Army had turned the place into a deadly trap, and the Germans wanted them to suffocate in it. As a change of strategy, an offensive with more than 600 artillery pieces was organized. Among them was a new monster never before used in combat.
In 1918, the Germans had bombarded Paris with the famous Big Bertha. The bombardment was not very effective, but the German army had been mortified that such a prestigious weapon had been developed and operated by the Navy. Between the wars, the army had been determined to develop its own supergun, and this had been achieved at the Krupp's works, where it was known as Gustav, after the head of the Krupp's family. The gunners who crewed the monster preferred their own nickname, Dora.
This cannon made it clear that war is not fought only with soldiers. It is also forged in factories, in the minds of engineers who designed the unthinkable. And the Third Reich understood this better than anyone. In its obsession to crush all resistance, it created weapons that seemed torn from a nightmare. Dora was a war monster. The largest artillery weapon ever built. It measured 47 meters long, and its shells could pierce 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 1 meter of steel. Transporting it required 25 special wagons, a titanic operation. But its mere presence was a spectacle, a message of power, a threat-made machine.
The 80-centimeter caliber gun fired 2 types of shell. A 4-ton shell could be fired nearly 30 miles, and a 7-ton concrete-busting round had a 23-mile range. The whole system weighed about 1,350 tons and took over a month to assemble. The firing detachment consisted of 500 men, but altogether 1,420 men under a major general worked to support and protect the weapon.
Its original purpose was to destroy the French fortifications of the Maginot Line. But when France fell quickly, the cannon was left without a target until Sevastopol. Now, Dora was not designed only to destroy, but also to intimidate, to tell the enemy that surrender was their only option. And it was not alone. The Karl Gerät, another titan of German artillery, was a 60-centimeter caliber self-propelled mortar. It weighed more than 120 tons and fired shells of almost 2 tons. Only 6 units were built. Before it, the Gamma Mörser had been manufactured, a veteran of the Great War with a caliber of 42 centimeters. It had been impressive in 1914, but by 1942 it still terrified its rivals. That is why it returned to the battlefield in Sevastopol. With the artillery pieces ready and the Luftwaffe's air support prepared, the great attack drew closer.
30th Corps were allocated 3 divisions and about a third of the artillery for a supporting attack. Their objective was the Sapun Heights, a naturally strong ridge that had been used by the British and French armies in the Crimean War to protect their besieging force from Russian attempts to relieve Sevastopol.
To the north of these forces, the Romanian Mountain Corps, Germany's ally in the Soviet invasion, was responsible for a containment operation in the hostile terrain of the Yala Hills. However, the main effort would be carried out by the German 54th Corps, supported by approximately 2/3 of the available artillery, including almost all of the super-heavy guns. Erich von Manstein had calculated every move and analyzed all possible scenarios. He was confident he could defeat the Soviets entrenched in that armored city. Sevastopol was about to feel the full power of the Nazi army.
The air and artillery bombardment began on the 2nd of June. While the Luftwaffe attacked the city and harbour to disrupt Soviet communications, the artillery concentrated on counter-battery work.
The sound of bombs became a symphony of destruction. For weeks, the Luftwaffe and German artillery pulverized Soviet fortifications. More than 46,000 tons of shells were dropped on the city. When everything lay in ruins, the Nazi soldiers pushed into the Soviet positions, where hand-to-hand fighting was brutal. The enemy was determined to resist, but German power remained overwhelming. On July 4th, 1942, after more than 250 days of siege, Sevastopol fell. Von Manstein reported to High Command that the fortress had been taken, although his men had paid a heavy price. The Nazis suffered 24,000 casualties. The Soviets lost more than 100,000 combatants, dead, wounded, and captured. The objective had been achieved. Crimea had finally fallen completely into the hands of the Third Reich. However, there was no atmosphere of victory. The exhaustion had been immense. The war continued, and Hitler turned his eyes to a new city, one that bore the name of his personal enemy, Stalingrad. The war machine pivoted. Von Manstein was withdrawn from the Crimean Peninsula and sent east. The 11th Army, exhausted and decimated after the hell of Sevastopol, was fractured, scattered. Crimea no longer interested Berlin, but for Moscow, it remained vital. With the Germans focused on the Volga, the Black Sea coast could breathe again. Soviet supplies resumed, garrisons reorganized, and defenses were rebuilt in silence. Adolf Hitler had won Crimea, but he had not secured it. And while the maps changed in Berlin, so did the men at the front. Morale began to crack. Months of fighting, cold, hunger, and comrades who never returned. As if that were not enough, rumors grew of thousands of Soviet soldiers training beyond the horizon. The enemy that in 1941 had fled in disarray now moved with cunning, camouflaged, and struck from the rear. The Red Army no longer improvised. It had learned from disaster. And beyond the great losses, the vastness of the country and its enormous population gave it a new chance. Commanders and strategies were renewed. The war of attrition, the one Germany had always sought to avoid, began to take shape. And while Hitler dreamed of conquering Stalingrad and the oil of the Caucasus, the Soviets were preparing their revenge in Crimea. The Wehrmacht had conquered the peninsula, taken Sevastopol, and bled the Soviets dry on every hill and bunker. But that was in 1942. 2 years later, in 1944, the roles were reversed. After the disaster at Stalingrad and the Red Army's offensive on the Dnieper, Crimea became a geographic trap, isolated, exposed, vulnerable. Yet the German High Command still insisted on holding it. The defense was organized around a fatal error. The Nazis assumed the Soviet counterattack would be slow, frontal, and predictable. It was not. The men of the USSR, led by Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, moved more than 500,000 soldiers, with heavy artillery and a dominant air force. The most devastating factor, however, was their speed. The Nazi defenses were unprepared, the reserves had not arrived, and coordination with the Romanians and Hungarians was chaotic. In April 1944, the Red Army launched its final offensive. German lines collapsed one after another. Hundreds of fighters, isolated, tried to retreat toward the coast. They looked to the sea as their only hope. Then the Führer's blunt order arrived: evacuation forbidden. Crimea had to resist to the last man. Hitler clung to a distorted vision of glory, which sealed the fate of his men. But there was no Dunkirk, no airlift. History was different for the Germans. There was only a chaotic attempt to escape through the port of Sevastopol under Soviet fire, while ships sank on the horizon. In just weeks, more than 60,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded and destroyed. The beaches became cemeteries. The tunnels and trenches, improvised tombs. Crimea, once a symbol of German power, was now its grave. Sevastopol, conquered in 1942 with giant mortars and millions of shells, was retaken in days by the unstoppable force of the Red Army. The liberation of Sevastopol was not a battle, it was a demolition. On May 9, 1944, after days of uninterrupted bombardment, Soviet artillery shattered the German positions. Assaults came from the north and east, combining infantry, tanks, and airstrikes. The city was taken meter by meter, while the defenders plunged into total chaos. Without support, without ammunition, and with orders to resist to the end, Axis soldiers were massacred, captured, or driven into the sea. For the Soviets, Sevastopol was part of their rebirth and the beginning of a long vengeance that would carry them to Berlin. The Battle of Crimea left a trail of devastation behind. More than 100,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians, and other allies, ended up dead, wounded, or captured in the final Soviet offensive of 1944 alone. On the Soviet side, losses were also enormous. More than 17,000 dead and approximately 67,000 wounded in a lightning campaign that, this time, was not German. In Crimea, the Nazis had their costliest victory and, 2 years later, their bitterest defeat. There, the limits of their ambition were set, and the collapse of an empire that believed it could subdue the Soviet Union was foreshadowed. But Stalin waited, learned, and struck back lethally. Thus, we reach the end of this documentary. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode as we continue exploring everything about military history.